Say this with me. The Holy Spirit. Say it with me. The Holy Spirit. This is an odd time in July to do this. But I have felt strongly impressed of the Lord that we need to lean into talking over the next several weeks about the Holy Spirit. Here's what I believe. I believe that within this room today, there are some individuals who have a very, very deep hunger to receive more from Jesus than they have ever experienced before. I also know that there are probably individuals in this room who are like, I'm good with where I'm at. I understand that. And while I was doing a prayer walk yesterday, I just sensed the presence of God in a moment. And I know sometimes these things can be subjective, but I was walking there and on this track, and I just sensed God say, you must lean into those who are hungry and not be concerned with those who are not. Because oftentimes we can allow our attention to go to people that literally are stiff-arming God. Now, these people may have been in church many years, but they're good with where they're at. They're fine with a minimal relationship with God. And they don't have a lot of hunger, per se, for God. They're good with Sunday morning, and that's about it. I remember years ago, I was walking into the Ramp, which is a ministry down in Alabama, during a conference. And the Lord just spoke to me, again, not an audible voice, but a strong impression of the Lord. And I felt the Lord say this to me. He said, stop looking at those who do not want me and start looking at those who do. Because it's easy for those that are in, quote, ministry. Now, we're all in ministry. Look at somebody and say, we're all in ministry. Okay. But it's easy sometimes for church leaders to get sidetracked by those individuals who, are okay with where they're at. And you can say, well, there's nobody that's really hungry for God. I want to tell you right now, there is a rising hunger for more of Jesus, because as we're moving in this nation right now, people are beginning to see we're beyond governmental solutions. We're beyond a political way that we can solve our issues. And people are beginning to say, I'm hungry for something more because my lifestyle is not doing it for me. We moved forward last year in recording these videos of the former people that were once in the LGBTQ community. And we're leaning into helping individuals. And I know, and there are some responses on our church Facebook page and things that are negative about what we're trying to do. But my recommendation is don't even respond to that, okay? Because there are individuals that are really looking for a way out, not just from that lifestyle, but from a lot of things. And I believe that there is a rising hunger that is happening in the nation right now. And I'm going to tell you what we're going to do here. We're not going to lean into the apathy of some people. We're going to lean in the hunger, because Jesus said, blessed are those who what? Hunger and thirst after righteousness, because they will be filled. Okay. So what I'm looking for is a filling. Okay. Jesus one day was teaching the Pharisees, and I'm not preaching yet. Jesus one day was teaching the Pharisees, and the disciples said to him afterwards, he said, Jesus, don't you realize that you offended them? And Jesus made a profound statement. You can read it in the Gospels. He said, leave them alone. Ignore them. And what, I don't want Jesus looking at me and saying, leave him alone. I want Jesus looking at me saying there's hunger there. And I want to tell you what, you may not understand it. You may not be able to define it. You may not be able to put it into words. You may not have a theological definition that you can say, this is exactly 1, 2, 3 what this is. You don't have to have any of that. All that you need is a hunger. And I believe, listen, I believe in this room today, there is enough hunger to break off every bondage and stronghold that somebody might be living under right now. Physically, emotionally, spiritually, financially, not just in this room, but I believe that there's enough hunger here today that can break the strongholds off this entire region. Because it doesn't take a lot of people. It only takes a handful of individuals who are hungry. Anybody in the room hungry today? I said, is there anybody in this room hungry today? So let's begin here. I just really sense the presence of the Lord here. Let's begin in the book of Acts, chapter number 2. And I don't know how far we'll get with this, and we'll pick up where we leave off next week. Acts chapter number 2. When the day of Pentecost came, they were all together and in one place. Suddenly, everybody say suddenly. There are divine suddenlies that occur throughout biblical and church history, but they're not random. There are preparations that had occurred in order to be able to get to a divine suddenly. Suddenly, a sound, and this is how Luke, the historian, describes this, and he doesn't really have words for it, but he says suddenly a sound. It sounded like the blowing of a violent wind. One theologian described it like this: the reverberating roar of a tornado. Just picture that in the room. You're in the room, and suddenly you're in a supernatural spiritual storm, and it sounded like a storm in the room where they were located at. Suddenly, a sound like the blowing of a violent wind came from heaven and filled the whole house. This is a group of hungry people. Because remember that when Jesus ascended, there were 500 people after the resurrection that saw him ascend into heaven. Now there's only 120. We don't know what happened to the other groups. You know, maybe they were working, maybe they had to go back to where they were from or whatever. But we know that everybody that saw Jesus ascend did not end up in the upper room. Filled the whole house. They weren't jumping around. They weren't standing on their head. What were they doing? They were sitting. Suddenly, they're seated in a chair, and instantly, a storm breaks out in the room. They can hear it, but then they're going to see it. They heard it first, and then they visually saw something. They saw what seemed to be tongues of fire that separated and came to rest on each of them, and all of them were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other languages as the Holy Spirit, not themselves, not somebody manipulating them, not somebody telling them what to do. We're on the back end of this looking to what took place, but remember, they don't know what is going to happen. The Holy Spirit suddenly descends in the room, and they are filled with the Spirit. Now let's walk through this verse for just a moment. When the day of Pentecost came, what was Pentecost? Pentecost was a celebration or a feast of the Jews that occurred every year, 50 days after the Passover. There were 7 different celebrations or feasts that would occur. They were happening since the days of Moses because God would initiate these through Moses when he was up on the mountain. And you had those people in the wilderness. If you read the text, this isn't today's message, but I want you to understand that everything powerful that God has ever done has come out of the wilderness. Moses comes out of the wilderness. Abraham comes out of the wilderness. Read the Old Testament. Then you get into the New Testament. John the Baptist comes out of the wilderness. Jesus is sent into the wilderness. Then he comes out in the power of the Holy Spirit. I just want you to understand today that when you feel like you are in a wilderness, that is the work of God. You're not outside of the will of God. It's not the devil. It's not a demon. I don't know where God is. I feel like I'm in the wilderness. That's God preparing you for something great. Everything that God has ever done comes out of a wilderness experience. Because you have to learn, you and I have to learn what it is to be alone with God only. And listen to His voice and hear His voice and grasp His voice. We have to be able to do that alone. Because if you can do it when you're in the wilderness, then you can easily shout when you're in the crowd. But if you can only shout in the crowd, then God has to take us to the wilderness so that we can understand what being with Him alone is really about. And so God would initiate these several different, as they were referred to as feasts or celebrations, and they would celebrate them every year. 4 of them would occur in the spring. There was, first of all, Passover. We're pretty familiar with that. Represents to us the sacrifice of Jesus. Immediately following that was something known as unleavened bread, and that was the sanctification piece. And then first fruits, which represented the resurrection. And then 50 days after Passover was this feast or celebration known as Pentecost. Happened every year. It was the offering. What they would do is they would harvest the first part of the barley, and it was called Pentecost, and they would offer it to God. It was known as Pentecost. It wasn't anything like super spiritual. It had happened for hundreds of years since the day that Moses and the people of Israel had been in the wilderness. It was interesting that God wanted these people celebrating these things over and over again to remind them about a relationship with Him. God is a very visual God. He wants us to be celebrating certain things over and over again, and so that we don't forget. This is the reason, honestly, why church is once a week, so we don't forget. Sometimes the mics don't work here. Not once a month. Not every other week. It's interesting that Jesus attended the synagogue every week. And I'm not trying to be legalistic here. And say, well, yeah, but there's problems in the church. Yeah, there were problems in the religious system of the day when Jesus was there too. But Jesus was faithful to it. And so they had all these celebrations. And